Good afternoon and welcome to this session that is about deploying Windows 8 using Lite Touch. My name is Michael, but everybody calls me Mike, so that's fine. We are going to cover a lot of things. Before we do that, here's the short story. I do live in Sweden. That's why I have an accent. I've been doing this for many years, which means that I have covered almost any scenarios that I know exist. I've been deploying Windows 95. That's a challenge. Running over network boot, over RPLs. I used 8-inch floppies, things like that. So I'm Jurassic Park. I'm the grumpy old guy that walks into the customer and says, no, you can't do that. No, it's not going to work. But what I try to do is I try to help them at least. And here's some of the things that we will cover today. One is the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. We're going to cover that really fast. We're going to talk about reference images, XE boot, drivers, and the main 3 scenarios that you can use for Lite Touch. Now, the first thing is the inventory thing. It's important to know what you're dealing with before you start. Even if you know what you have, it's really important that you verify that whatever you know is correct. Now, as a consultant, I have been working with customers for many years, and I remember back, I think it's like 6 years ago, we were doing a migration for a customer. We were supposed to migrate their offices into a cloud solution. It wasn't called cloud at that time, called application service provider. It's pretty much the same thing. Anyhow, when we were done, the customer said, how many offices did you migrate? The 10s you gave me. Oh, we have 12. So if a customer can accidentally forget about 2 entire offices in 2 different cities, there might be things that you're missing regarding firmware, BIOS, asset numbers, MAC addresses, and the tiny things. So even if everybody says, we know, I still say, could we please invest 60 minutes installing MAP, do an inventory of a network, and verify that you actually only have HP and some Lenovo's and some Dell's and some others. And that you only run Windows XP and some Vista and some NT4 and some others. So we have that on a piece of paper. Without further delay, let's flip over to a demo that and make this fast. There you go. So this is a download, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to turn off this one right now. It's a simple download. When you did do the download, you install it. It installs the database. You can install it on a server. It doesn't even require Office or databases anymore. It will install everything directly. So it's a really small download. This is version number 8. When that is done, the first thing you do is inventory. I've already done an inventory, but doing an inventory basically means you need to have access to the machines, because it's doing a local WMI query on each and every machine. And for that to work, we need to open the firewall. And that's pretty easy when we have a Windows XP machine that has the native built-in firewall. However, when the customer runs a third-party antivirus solution, it becomes more interesting to make that work. And even if we know how that works, maybe we're not allowed to for security reasons. So the inventory part is actually the hard part because we need to reach out each and every machine. You can have multiple databases if you want to. The only reason to have multiple databases is because you work as a consultant. You create one database per customer, you do an inventory, you go back, and you have the entire environment back home with all the machines and inventory data, which is nice to have. It is also possible to do other things besides doing client things. In this case, it's only client. So the first thing you do is you run the inventory wizard. And here you specify what you want to know. Now, if you're a consultant and you work for that customer and you sell things, you might want to be smart enough to do inventory of other things at the same time. As a consultant, it's very nice to be able to provide information of maybe you should upgrade your office because you're running an office version that I haven't seen for 15 years. Or maybe we should consider to standardize around the browsers you're using. Right now we have 15 different flavors. And maybe we should have at least only 6 versions of the SQL Server or something like that. So you pick and choose whatever you would like to inventory. In this case, Windows servers, and I can also do active devices and users. That means it's going to ask Active Directory. So I can see if this environment is clean. Would you like to have a feeling when you come to a customer if the environment is maintained, right? Because if it's maintained, most likely if it's maintained in one location, it is maintained in other locations as well. If it's really ugly in one place, it's going to be ugly all over the place. So I do an inventory just to get a feeling of that information. Then you type in, then you decide where should you query. I mean, query Active Directory, should we browse a work group, things like that, scan an IP address range, import from a text file, specify name and password for querying the domain. That's not going to work. That's going to work better. When you do inventory the machines, it's nice to only inventory the machines that is actually going to be migrated, upgraded, inventoried, the machines you really care about. So don't do the entire domain. It's going to end up searching for things all over the place, and you're going to have a lot of machines that doesn't exist at all. So you should specify the OU. And here comes the fun part. You ask the customer, where do you have your workstations in the Active Directory? What do you mean by that? Then you need to do it this way. You need to have an account. This account is not accessing Active Directory. This is the account that accesses, for instance, in this case it's both, but I can say this is the local account on every machine, and then you create a new account and say, on that machine it's only the Active Directory account, and this account only needs read permissions in Active Directory, because it's just reading the assets. I'm going to use the same account for both of them. And then you do next, and then you can see I'm going to use the following credentials for the following. And then I do finish, and it takes how long does it take? Well, you know, map is really fast. I saw a number a couple of years ago. It says we can inventory about 10,000 machines per hour. What do you think will happen with the network traffic when you do a connection to 10,000 machines at the same time? Well, this is a funny fire drill, because if the customer claims they have network monitoring, they will call you and say, what are you doing? If they don't have a working networking monitoring infrastructure, but they claim, then you find a flaw in the monitoring component, because they actually miss that you're doing a WMI query to all these machines at the same time. You can run this query over and over again, and you can add more and more stuff to it. It will never re-inventory a machine again. If it has it in the database, it's in the database. It will never be re-inventoried. It's only the machines that is missing. So you can add an OU and run the inventory again. For a large environment, it takes about 2 to 3 days, and you need to run it manually 4 or 5 times, different times. And the goal is not to get 100% of the computers. That will never, ever happen. The goal is to see what we have, and to be able to present some kind of information to whomever is responsible. Can we or can we not run Windows 8 on these machines? Can we or can we not run Office 2013 on these machines? What is the requirement to make this work? So in this case, it's Windows 8 readiness, and of course, 2-machine works perfectly fine. That's nice. And we have 2 machines that was not powered on at the moment. Before you generate the readiness and report, you should customize the asset. Now, there's something wrong with these numbers. This is the minimum system requirements for running Windows 8 on a 32 and a 64-bit machine. Raise your hand if you think that is the perfect machine for gaming, 3D CAD system, developers, and other IT-intensive applications. That is the CEO. I'm running around and read mail. And I don't even reply, because I don't have the power to do that. Now, when you change these numbers, the only one that is really important is the amount of memory. And I would guess most of you will do this. And that is incorrect. Why is that incorrect? It's looking for the maximum available memory in a machine. And since almost every graphic adapter is using the memory as a part of the built-in graphic, you will not have 4096. You will have 128 megabytes below that. So you should bump them up so you include the memory that will be, or bump them down a bit. So let's say 3072, or maybe 3000, I don't know, 500, something like that. That way you will cover all the 4 gig machines too. Then you have reports. And there are 2 kinds of reports. Excel spreadsheet is what you use to find out the details. The Word document is something you hand over to someone that likes pie chart and makes decision based on that, because they don't contain any useful information from a technical standpoint. However, they are extremely fancy to show someone that likes pie chart, and they go like, oh, this makes perfectly sense. And you should not reply, it doesn't for me, but it doesn't really at all for me. When you've done the inventory, it's time to start thinking about creating a reference image. Johan and I have a session on Friday morning, 8:30, about creating the perfect reference image. But we're going to cover the basics here. So number 1 is the thin or thick. And nobody has a thin and nobody has a thick. Everybody has a hybrid of that. What is the benefit of having a thin or thick? Well, don't think of benefits, think about time, because this is only about time. You need to ask yourself, what is the maximum time allowed to install, reinstall, or replace a computer? The maximum time you are allowed to deploy Windows is a value that you consider when you decide to do thin or thick. Let me give you an example. A customer says, it's okay if it takes 15 hours to install Windows. I would do a thin image. I wouldn't even do an image. 15 hours, I can install Windows in 15 hours and run Windows Update on that. It's going to be extremely flexible, no maintenance, I never need to do anything about it at all. Another customer tells me, it's 45 minutes. I can't do thin image in 45 minutes. The image will work, but the application that is supposed to be installed after the operating system is done is going to take considerably longer time than those stipulated 45 minutes. In that case, I need to do a thick image. Time is what decides if you do thin or thick. If you do thin, you don't need to maintain that at all, or very seldom. If you do a thick, you need to maintain and recreate a new thick image more often. The ideal for me is to try to create reference images somewhere between 2 to 4 years per year. You need to put things in. Even if you decide to do the thin image, there's going to be a couple of things that you should have within the image. And now we need to have support for applications. In Windows 8, .NET Framework 2.0 and 3.5 is not included. It's not even included on the media. It's actually on another folder on the media. So when you deploy a Windows 8 machine, if you don't include .NET Framework, basically no application will work at all if you don't install .NET Framework. Which you're going to realize is not that easy, because if you do an add roles and features or add Windows components, which is called in the client, it's going to say, I don't have that, but I'm going to do a Windows update. But I couldn't. I'm sorry. And there you are, on a beach somewhere and trying to connect back to the office using the VPN client, and it doesn't start. The only thing that saves you now is to have the ISO image. Trust me, you really need to have .NET Framework inside your image. The other thing that is most likely to be used is Visual C++. Many applications that Microsoft writes are either written in .NET Framework or in C++. As long as we talk about agent, backup agent, operation manager agent, monitoring stuff, things that are a bit more low level, most of that stuff is written in C++. So why do you need to have them on the image? Well, let's assume that you deploy an agent for something. And that's going to install, if it's not already installed, the C++ components. Do you think it's going to install the latest? Nope. It's going to install exactly that version that is required for that application to work. 2 seconds later, the Windows Update icon will pop up at the user's desk and say, there's updates. So even if you're not forced to do a reboot when you install that agent, it will result in that the user believes that he needs to reboot the machine anyway. So it's very inconvenient. So if you run a 32-bit operating system, of course you should have the 32-bit version of the C++ runtimes. But if you do a 64-bit, you need a 64-bit and the 32-bit. Another component that we put in very often is Silverlight. We put in Silverlight mostly because when we do System Center, most of the self-service portals are based on Silverlight. So we add Silverlight from the beginning. And as you recognize, all these 3 components that I'm talking about is Microsoft components. They are easy to put in the reference image because when you do a Windows update, they will automatically be patched. I didn't put any other third-party applications in here. We do get questions about the, why don't you put an antivirus application in the reference image? I wouldn't do that, even if someone is paying for it. An antivirus application will most likely break the sysprep process. If it doesn't, it's going to break something else. And if it doesn't break anything, it's just not going to work anyway. It's going to show up in the antivirus console as 4000 mini-NT dash some crazy name, because they don't really handle that identity. Good day, sir.
Swag.
Thank you. You can receive a book for that. Just kidding. There might be other things you should put in the reference image, but this is what we go for when we do a thin image. It's also misspelled, Johan, so you don't need to take a note of that. Things that you might want to put in the reference image could be IE, Internet Explorer, latest version. Let's say they are coming with Internet Explorer, I don't know, 11, 12, 13, something like that. Something new. Well, then you should absolutely put that in the reference image if that is something that you have checked and verified that it works with all your internal applications. So, let's see how that works. So, to be able to create this reference image, there is actually two ways of doing this. One way is the incorrect way of doing it, and the other one is the correct way of doing it. The incorrect way is, of course, to do a manual installation of Windows, take a note of everything you do, and then remember it to the next time you're going to do the same thing. You can also type everything down in a piece of paper, and then you can search for that piece of paper 6 months later when you're supposed to do the next reference image. Some of you are laughing. That is a very common method of creating a reference image. Someone did it, and we have no clue on how it was created. We call it the golden image. That's something that everybody worships, and everybody has a copy of it. And every morning we dance around the golden image, and we have smoke, and we sing songs, and we hope it will work today too. So instead of doing that, you download Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, you install Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, and you install something called a ADK, Automated Deployment Toolkit. You could use the old Wake Toolkit, but I prefer to use ADK because it contains Windows P 4.0, and that is a bit faster. When that is done, the first thing you do is that you create a deployment share. We normally use two deployment shares, one for creating reference images and for playing, and the other for production. There are so many reasons for this. Let's say that you're going to shift into Configuration Manager at a later time. Then you keep the lab deployment because you're still going to do reference images that way. And then you get rid of the other one because that's no longer needed. So it's very nice to have it built that way from the beginning. Then it's not that hard. In applications, we add all the application that is supposed to be in the reference images. We add operating system to operating system. We don't add any drivers because we don't need any drivers when we create a reference image. But I still have customers asking, but what if I create the reference image on a physical machine that requires drivers? Then you're doing it wrong. You should never, ever, ever, ever create a reference image on a physical machine. It's the funniest experience in your lifetime. You're going to have so much fun with that. You install your reference image on a HP machine, which has some nice touchpad. and it finds the driver for a touchpad. It also finds the application. And now you deploy that image on a Dell machine. That has almost the same touch device, not exactly. And then you have an HP application that is supposed to work together with your Dell driver. And then it doesn't work, and you call support, and good luck. The only reason we have a virtual machine is that a virtual machine is neutral. So if you don't have a virtual machine, you can also take a Pentium 60, because that's pretty much a neutral machine, that too. It's steam-powered and was created like 100 years ago. But that's going to be very slow. That's why we do virtual machines. Now, there are one virtual machine vendor that you shouldn't use. There's nothing wrong with their product. It's just that they are not neutralized. Hyper-V works perfectly fine. VMware works perfectly fine. VirtualBox, however, does not work perfectly fine in all cases because it's emulating UEFI BIOSes. It can emulate basically everything. So it's a really cool test platform, but it's really bad from the perspective of having a neutral machine. So Hyper-V or VMware or even Zen works. So we don't have any drivers. We don't really need to have any packages either. Packages are patches or language packs. I prefer to do patches using WSUS update instead. But it's possible to do. The only time we really put packages in here is because we need to have that particular patch, which is not available for WSUS. It's a secret download that nobody can download. You need to call someone and you get approved, and it's big secret, everything. It's a patch. And then you create task sequences. And you create basically one task sequence for each reference image you have. So let's see how that looks like. Here I added a bunch of applications. And you can see I have something called Configure Microsoft IE10. That is not IE10 by itself. That's from the IE Internet Explorer Administrator Kit. Because if you want to configure IE so it works the way it's supposed to work, the configuration in the unattended XML file is not good enough. Download the IKE toolkit and fix IE so you can just say, this is the default search engine we are going to use. Make it compatible with Windows 7. Make it this work. Remove that. All those configuration is done by the IEK. Then we have Office, we have Silverlight, and you can see I have all the Visual C++ runtimes in here. I also have a strange thing called Remove Unattended XML File, and we're going to cover that on Friday morning. Here I imported the operating system. You do that by right-clicking and point to the DVD, and then you're done. One thing that you should be picky about is naming. You will have the solution for at least one or two versions, right? At least two versions, this version and maybe next version. Maybe there's going to be an SP1 for Windows 8. So take measurements from the beginning so you can import multiple versions of Windows 8 and Windows 7 and Windows XP so the naming of folders and all that stuff really works over the time. No drivers, but I do have a sequence. And creating a task sequence is pretty simple. You give it an ID, you give it a name, you pick a sequence, and there is actually a sequence that people ask me about from time to time. There is a sysprep and capture. Yes. That means I can do a manual installation of Windows and then sysprep and capture. Absolutely. It should have a warning sign after that text, but it doesn't. it's not going to work that nice. And the problem is that it's hard to repeat because it's still a manual. It is in there, so it is possible to use. However, the only one that we use is the standard client task sequence. And then you pick the operating system. And I don't need to specify a product key. All this information is pretty pointless because I don't want to put that information into the unattended XML file. I would like to have all the configuration outside. In the text file, I need to manually edit the text file. If you put the password in the unattended XML file and you forget about the password, oh, it's just open the XML file together with a calculator and recalculate what the password is because it's hashed. So it's not that easy. This is how the sequence looks when it's done. I actually didn't do any modification, and the only modification you need to do is to enable Windows Update. Windows Update is disabled by default. And to be able to do that, you also need to specify what Windows Update server you're going to use. And that is done in something called rules. The file is called customsettings.ini, and that is the control file for the Lite touch environment. So everything that you want to do to control how Windows is supposed to be installed and configured, you most likely will do everything in customsettings.ini. And here you can see I specified the WSUS server and say this is the one you should go for. If you don't specify that and you check the box saying please do Windows Update, it's going to go out on the internet and download the patches. And that's going to work. It's going to take forever. We are talking about easily an hour extra or so, because it's actually going out and downloading a patch, by patch, updating, rebooting, checking again and again. So please have your local WSUS server. So the question is, why did I specify the custom port of 8530? Well, if you install WSUS on the server 2012 today, it will be installed on that new port because port 80 is already in use. So most of these servers today run on that specific port. So when all that is done, there's only a few steps left to do. And that is to configure the deployment share by itself. You specify what platforms you're supposed to support, and you configure Windows PE. Now, I changed the name of this. Since you're going to have two boot images, one for production and one for the build lab, it's nice to have different name. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a bunch of ISOs, and everybody is called Lite Touch. Thank you. Then I know. So I changed the name for them. I don't need to modify any features, and I don't really need to modify anything about drivers and patches. Since I'm not going to install any drivers and patches, or at least drivers, there's no need to change this. But I usually do, as an old habit, I specify selection profile nothing and install everything from nothing, which means even if you put in a driver, it will never go into the Windows PE image and it will never be used. When you're done, you right-click and you wait about 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, depends on the hard drive you have, because it's going to generate WIM files and ISO images. But there might be other things you want to consider configuration first. If you go into rules, there's a file called bootstrap.ini. This file controls the boot behavior in Lite Touch. I don't like to type in the name and password when I create a reference image. So I create a user account, and I put the password in the text file and go, are you insane? It's a password in a text file. Yeah, so that account has the ability to install Windows and upload a WIM file. But we are not allowed to do that with domain accounts. You don't need to have a domain account. You can have a local account. That works too. Doesn't need permissions anywhere other on the deployment server to retrieve the files and upload a WIM file. So it doesn't need to be a domain account. All these settings means go to this server, attach to that share, use the following name and password, and don't show up the nice welcome. Besides that, I also modified a bunch of other settings. Things like time zone, password, WSUS server. Don't apply any GPO packs. GPO packs is nice if they are configured. If they are by default and you didn't try them, you will have fun. So you do all those things. And then, I don't like to answer all the questions. So I skip a bunch of questions. Don't show me that, don't ask for that, and so on and so on. And the net result is, of course, to fire up the machine. Here it is. Now, one of the questions that pops up from time to time is it possible to do this automatically? Yes, it is. We are running virtual machines. Is it possible to create a virtual machine using a script? Yes. Can you define the MAC address the machine should have? Yes. Can you have a static MAC address in customsettings.ini that says, if this is the MAC address, then run this task sequence with the following settings and don't ask any questions? Yes. Could I then wait until the machine has been turned off and steal the WIM file? Yes. So I can automate that? Yes. So I create my own reference images once a week. Just because I can. Next. It's going to ask this question for one simple reason. Sometimes I need to do a VHD as a reference image, and sometimes I need to have a WIM file. If I want to do virtual machines, there's no point of having a WIM file. I can do the VHD file instead. And then you do next, and then you're done. So that was pretty easy. Now, when we start deploying machines in the real world, running around with an ISO is everything but funny. And if you see my body shape, you will realize that running around is not a thing I do very often. Instead, I use something called Windows Deployment Services and boot over a network. It is easy to configure on a local network. However, when it comes to routing, it becomes a bit more tricky. And the trick is to convince the networking guys to configure their routers correctly. And there are only two ways of fixing this. You need to convince them to do IP helpers. How do you make networking guys do IP helpers? Two ways. Either you buy a bottle of expensive whiskey, or you start mass deploying machines in the environment. Because if you do that, you're going to kill the network. That's the only way. I prefer the whiskey because that's easier and faster, and I've done it so far 4 times. And every time it was impossible, And suddenly it is possible. It's actually going to be fixed this afternoon. Okay, thank you so much. Now, we're not going to use Windows Deployment Services fully. We're only going to use a part of it. The only thing we use Windows Deployment Services is two things. We use it for Pixie Boot and multicast. That's it. All the other features, not in use at all. Which means that we're never going to touch anything like drivers or anything. The only thing we do is we add the boot image, and it's good enough to install, only use the 32-bit. And that's a lie. Because now you can see new hardware is coming. And we have the very nice new UEFI BIOS. And that's not cross-platform. For a 32-bit UEFI machine, you need a 32-bit boot image. For a 64-bit UEFI machine, you need a 64-bit boot image. And not all of them can even boot on Pixie, because the only way to install that particular device, you need to boot on a USB stick. And if you ask the vendors, do you support UEFI? They go like, yeah, absolutely. Even old machines, yeah. All the old machines. Not all, but most of them. And then you go back home and you flip on UEFI in your BIOS and it pops up a text saying, this is a dev and test environment not supported for production. Okay, so you have the function of UEFI, you just don't support it. No, because it's, legacy and we don't know. So new devices do require both 32 and 64-bit. When that is imported, you're done. You need to verify that the setting for the Pixie response is set to respond to all clients known and unknown, because we're not using the known functionality at all. We just Pixie boot, hands it over to Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, and everything is handed over from there. Except for the multicast. Now, you don't need to configure multicast that much. Most likely, it will be good enough to say separate clients into either 2 or 3 sessions. And they will automatically be separated into those 3. And when you do have a machine that is awfully slow, it's going to be separated in a separate track so it doesn't slow down the other machines. But you should keep track of them, because most likely there is something wrong with that machine, or the networking cable it's using, or the switch it's attached to. It shouldn't have a performance of 4 kilobits per second. That's really bad. But we see that from time to time. You should also be aware of the fact that if you have a small environment and you're using like wireless, some of these devices has a very nice feature. Ethernet doesn't really support multicast. Multicast gets translated into broadcast. So if the wireless network access points doesn't really support that, and you deploy one machine, you're going to have a bunch of people calling you because they can't send an email anymore anyway, and they can't access the help desk support page at all because the wireless network just died. Solution: separate wireless traffic from ordinary traffic. You need to put a router in between. When that is done, you're up and running. So we have Pixie supported, and one of the other things is drivers. We need to deal with drivers. There are 2 ways of dealing with drivers, mainly. And this depends on how big your project is. Are you going to support it? Who's paying for this? How much time do I have? Either you do total chaos. Total chaos means pick every driver you need to have add it to the repository in Lite Touch, and hope that plug and play detects the correct driver, downloads the correct driver, and then you hope that Windows will figure out how to do the driver stuff. Plug and play. Do you think that works? Anybody heard of something called two-tier drivers? A two-tier driver is a driver for the USB bus. When that driver is loaded, it discovers another device, and that needs another driver. When Windows P does a plug-and-play scan, it doesn't load any drivers. It only detects the plug-and-play on first tier, which means when you deploy the machine, the USB 3.0 Rensis electronics driver is halfly installed. The network adapter might work. The audio card has half the components installed. So plug and play works in Windows because Windows is going to do a repeat of the device scan. Windows P doesn't do that. So I prefer to have the other method, which is total control. I know what drivers is supposed to be injected in that machine. So how do I know that? Well, it's not that hard. Raise your hand if you do Dell machines. Okay, so you do Dell machine, that means you know what the cab files are. That's easy. Okay, if you do HP, raise your hand if you do HP. Then you know what Softpak downloader is, and they also have cab files. Lenovo, yeah. So Lenovo has their retriever, Lenovo retriever, when you specify the models you have and you download it. So it's all about using the right application, download the drivers, and then inject the drivers, right? So let's flip back and see how that works. So there's actually two steps in this. Number one is to create a decent folder structure. That's what I call a decent folder structure. I have WinP drivers because sometimes you need to have dedicated Windows P drivers. If that multi-tier, two-tier driver needs to be a part of the Windows P process, you need to have another driver, a monolithic driver, when they combine both of these plug-and-play addresses into one. It's usually called RIS drivers or something. Obscure, they're in a separate folder, and it's like, oh, this is WinP. But we know where to get those drivers, right? Because Dell has it on this cab and FTP site, HP has the same, and Lenovo has the same. So we put those drivers in there, but we only put the drivers in there when we really need them. So first you try, and if you do get an IP address, and you can see the hard drive, then you have the drivers you need. Yeah, but they might be later and greater. Don't go for that. Most likely you will break something else, and some other mold doesn't work. So be very careful about putting drivers in WinP. Only put the drivers you really need to have there. The other thing is pretty easy. This is a folder called Windows 8, and here you can see a folder called HP EliteBook 8560W. That is the WMI name for this machine. In my case, I have another model. Of course I have another model. In this case, it's called HP EliteBook 8460p. So that's going to be the folder structure. This only applies to Lite Touch. When you do Configuration Manager, you need to do it in a different way, but here we can actually do this. So I have a folder name that has the exact match of the WMI query name. The task sequence looks pretty much the same as I did in the other, except for one small detail. We modify the driver step here. I inject a set variable. In this case, I set the driver group 001 equals to Windows 8 \% model %. Percent model % will be resolved into whatever model I have. And then I flip this one, and this seems to be an issue for someone. I set it to something very logical. It says install everything from nothing. Okay. What it means is turn off plug and play, take all the drivers you have in the driver group named driver path 001 and take those drivers and junk them down to the local machine so they will be on the C drive, and then hand it over to Windows to do the plug and play. That means we copy all the drivers for that particular model down to that machine. And then Windows is going to pick the drivers it actually needs. So that is disabling plug and play and shifting into total control. That's basically the only modification you need to do. Besides that, there are other small things. For instance, I enable monitoring. Monitoring is a very nice feature where you can see the progress of deployment. You can keep track of all the machines that is running. It's going to update in the deployment workbench. There are numerous ways of reading that information because it's published as OData. I did a blog post a while back on how to use Excel spreadsheets to read that if you want to do that. What are you doing? I'm updating my Excel spreadsheet so I can see the deployment progress of my 400 machines in Excel, in a pie chart. That's nice. You also need to configure Windows PE, and here are the main things you need to configure. You need to change the name, and you need to flip the scratch space to 128 megabytes. We need to flip the scratch space because the temporary drive while we're doing installation in Windows when we inject all the drivers is on X colon. X colon is Windows PE. That means that we need to be able to extract the drivers and unzip and do things on the X drive. Anybody thinks that an NVIDIA driver fits in 32 meg? Trust me, it doesn't. So we flip it up to 128. We don't need to do that for Configuration Manager because they have the temp drive set on C. But I do modify the features. Since we're running Windows PE 4.0, it is possible to add other things. In this case, I added the dism command dots. You don't need them, but it's nice to have them. I also added .NET Framework 4 and Windows PowerShell 3.0, so I can have that as a part of my deployment solution, even in Windows PE. And I also added the Microsoft Diagnostics and Recovery Toolkit Dart. If you do have software assurance and you do have Dart, you should absolutely integrate Dart with the solution. And it's really advanced. I mean, this is a 3-day training course, I think. You install the Dart toolkit. It's going to be in Dart. And you're going to see there's two files they are called Tools 64 and 86. It's cab files. You take those two files and then you copy them. And if you take an educated guess, one of them goes into the x64 folder and the other one goes in the 86 folder. You figure it out. If you don't, you can call Johan. He has free support on that subject. So I add those, and I also flip the selection profile for Windows PE, so it only includes the 32 for 32 and 64 for 64. And that is done by creating something called a selection profile. And a selection profile, it's just a name saying this is the only items we will include in that folder. So 32-bit driver goes in 32 and 64 goes for 64. So we are a bit picky when we do Windows PE. Those drivers we do in WinPE are strange. Most likely they are odd drivers, legacy thing, maybe something that doesn't really handle the 64 and 32-bit correctly. So that's why I do 64 in the 64 folder and 32 in the 32. I don't do that when I do the operating system deployment, because Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, when you import the drivers, they detect if it's incorrect. I had a long, nice discussion with the Microsoft guy and said, yeah, you know, vendors, they are so bad, they are so bad. So I try to import the Microsoft drivers. Talking about bad. They, of course, flag themselves incorrectly as 32, but it's only a 64 and vice versa. So I don't really need to do that. It's just about importing the drivers straight up. When that is done, we need to configure other things, and we configure other things here in the custom settings.ini. And in this case, you can see I added the database rules, but we're going to cover that in a couple of seconds. Other things, you can see time zone, password, things like that. We have the UD share, where you're supposed to store data. We have a list of different domain OUs you should be able to pick from the wizard, and we have a bunch of skips. It is possible, excuse me, it is possible to configure Light Touch to be totally silent, and don't ask for any questions at all. The most important thing when you build this is not aiming for the perfect solution day one. You should aim for the working solution day one. So stick with the wizard until you've figured out what things should be silent. Search for them in the help file and move them over, run it again, until it is as silent as you would like it to be. I see all these guys trying to build, you know, the perfect thing the first time they ever see this, and it's just not there. I mean, it's never going to be perfect. So go for version 1, 2, 3. Version 1 works. Version 2 is nice. And version 3, that's awesome. Most of us never come to that part. When it works, it's like, yeah, it works. So we have all that. Same story here for the rules in bootstrap.ini. You can see I have everything, but I removed the password. You don't need to have that at all. I mean, you don't need to have the user domain or user ID. You can have it prompted for you. So you type in the username and the domain if you want to do that. But this is how I have done it. So it will ask me for the password. Is it possible to put in the password? Absolutely. But now there will be discussions with the security guys. You have a password. That's clear text in an INI file that is on a bootable media somewhere. Is that really secure? Well, not really. You can limit the functions and the access this account can do, but it's still going to be an access account. When that is done, we can deploy new machines. That's the wrong machine. That's the right machine. So let's power it up. Excuse me. Sometimes we get questions about why do we do Pixie when we do a virtual machine? Should you do that? No, you should never do that. This is a demo. If you do virtual machines and you want to deploy them, you either use ISOs or you use reference images based on VHD or VHDX files. You never ever use Pixie because it's really slow. That's number one, and it's not that easy to automate. So it's easier to do it in other ways. But you can imagine this is a physical machine. We had some customer reporting the little circle in the middle freezing exact at that moment. It just freezes. And people go like, what's wrong? Why does it freeze? And Johan knows the answer. It's something about something called the NX bit. Windows P 4.0 requires the machine, the PC, to have the NX bit set. Some old hardware doesn't support NX. It's a no execute bit. And some new hardware have an old BIOS or old firmware. So if it freezes at that moment, check for firmware upgrade or check for replacing the hardware. Or stop using ADK and switch back to the Wake toolkit because Windows P3 doesn't need that. On the other hand, then you can't deploy Windows 8. You can only deploy Windows 7. You can see that the background picture here is branded from the infamous company via Monstra. I'm going to do a custom Windows 8 x64. And I modified the custom settings.ini so I can be able to pick things here. I need to type in the computer name. This computer name is going to be PC0011. It's going to ask me if I want to save the data that is on the machine. It's blank, so I'm not going to do that. And it's also going to ask me to restore the data. This is what you use when you do a replace, when you run a replace. This is not a replace, this is a fresh machine, so I'm going to do next. I'm going to do next. And then it's going to ask me what applications do you need to install. Well, I'm going to install that application. And I do next. And I'm pretty much done. So if we flip back again and see what did we do. Well, here is actually the application. And this application is a Windows 8 application. In that case, you just specify the appx file. It's automatically going to handle sideloading. And if you ever want to support on this application, he's over there. The application does nothing but says, hello world, and you can click on it. But it's a nice application. You can, of course, add other applications. So where did I get the image from? Well, the image that I have here is a custom image. And that is the image I got when I created my reference images, and then I imported this image as a custom image together with the setup files from the operating system folder. Now, doing a bare metal installation is fine. We know that that works, but that's just one scenario. Sorry. Another scenario is the refresh scenario. The refresh means that we reinstall the operating system. We keep the user data locally on the machine. We wipe the machine clean. We install Windows, and we restore the user state, the user data, in the same location it was before, together with the settings and all that stuff. So what do you need to configure to make that happen? The correct answer is nothing. If you don't do anything at all, it's going to work most likely for most organizations. Someone mentioned USMT, hands up. Yeah, so the only reason you need to configure USMT is that you need something else than default. And the default in Lite Touch is pretty nice. It's going to scan the hard drive for well-known applications and create a list of all those file settings. And then it's going to take all those files. So the only time we really need to configure USMT is when we don't need or want to have it all. But when we do a refresh, what's the benefit of excluding files? None, because it takes the same amount of time. So it's when we do a replace when it makes sense to configure USMT to exclude a bunch of files. There will be some settings you need to configure, but that depends on the size of the organization. So for companies and organizations that have less than 500 machines, we very rarely do anything about USMT at all. So here's a PC. And I need to refresh this PC. And I do that by going into the Start button, and then I run the Lite Touch command. Over the network, and it's going to fire up basically the same wizard. The only time this doesn't really work is when you have really old XPs, because then WMI is broken. And it has been broken for a couple of years, but nobody noticed that until you start using this. It's using WMI to query, but WMI doesn't work. So the wizard never starts. How do you fix that? Yeah, well, you can do the reset WMI obscure blog post somewhere around the globe, and just mess it up, and then you restart the machine, and then WMI works decent enough to be able to perform a refresh. Or you manually copy the data using any tool you have. And then I do custom. In this case, it's going to say PC001 because that's the old name. And I do next, and I go through this. And it's going to wipe the machine clean. It's going to install Windows, and I can select applications if I had that. I also need to type in the credentials for this. And then the machine is done. Now it's just a matter of waiting before it's done. And we're not going to wait for that. So the last scenario is the replace scenario. The replace scenario means that we run the gather, we run the USMT part on one machine. And I'm going to revert to that and fire it up again. So we question over there, yes?
In-place upgrade, how do you handle drives that are...
In-place upgrades. We don't do in-place upgrades.
Well, you know what I mean. What you just showed where you use the hard links.
Yeah, refresh.
Refresh.
Yep.
With the hard drive that's encrypted.
With a hard drive that is encrypted. That depends. If the hard drive is encrypted using BitLocker because you're going from Vista to Windows 7 or 7 to 8 or something like that, then it works perfectly fine. If you use a third-party application, now it's a time to test the support and see if they have one. Most likely they don't have that. So that means you need to treat that scenario as a replace scenario, because de-encrypting the drive takes everything between 2 to 10 hours, and then you can do a refresh, and then you need to re-encrypt it. So for most of these customers, they either shift into another technology, or they get grumpy. That was a really good question. Thank you, Johan. And a really good question is rewarded by this amazing book. Johan, run. Thank you, sir. He actually can run. Thank you. So if we're going to do a refresh, a replace instead, we do it the same way. At least close to. We just pick another sequence. I do the replace task sequence. And it says automatically determine the location. And it says allow data and settings to be stored locally when possible. And it's like, no, it's going to be... I configure that in custom settings.ini, so it will store everything on the server. I do next, and I'm not going to do a backup of the machine. And I do next, and I type in the password. In this case, it's not going to use hard link. It's going to do copy over the network. And now it would be nice to do a configuration of USMT to avoid that. Now it's reading all the settings we have, and in the end you're going to see it's going to run a PowerShell runbook. Because you can extend the task sequences with the orchestrator runbooks. And I've done that, so what's going to run in the end is a move computer. It's going to move the computer, because this is going to be disabled because it's the own one, so it's going to move it to another location. And that is things you can do by extending the solution. And just a quick glimpse of that. Here we can have a runbook that gets the computer name, finds the computer in Active Directory, and moves the computer. And this is the actual runbook that I have for disabling machines. It's going to get the computer, move the computer, and then disable the computer. I grayed out the disabled computer because I'm doing demos of it over and over, and I hate to enable it again because I always forget that. How do you run a runbook from within a task sequence? Well, we showed you that yesterday, but basically this is how it looks like. Where's my task sequences? So this is the replace task sequence when you run it from the old machine. And in the bottom, you can see it has something called an execute orchestrator runbook. So I connect to my orchestrator server, and then I define what runbook I will run, and then I can move the machine. But this is, of course, only available if you do have a System Center orchestrator in your environment. So using Microsoft Deployment Toolkit to deploy machine is perfectly fine. It works nice. I've been doing it for many years. Is it suitable for small companies? Yeah. Can you do it with large enterprises? Yeah. Like 300,000 computers? Yeah. Works too. It's just that what is missing is management. We can deploy an entire infrastructure based on Windows 8, but the tools we have for free doesn't include management. So someone still needs to be able to do that after. So this could be a project you run because you're waiting for the infrastructure for Configuration Manager 2012 Service Pack on to be online. When is that going to happen? It's going to happen the next summer. And you want to deploy Windows 8 before that. So then you can do Lite Touch, and then you can install the Configuration Manager agent after. So there are a number of reasons. Even System Center customers are actually using Lite Touch to deploy all these things. We covered that, and we covered that. And you got a copy of the book, so you don't need to buy this book. I have 15 seconds to say thank you for stopping by at this session. Johan and I will have a Birth of a Feather later on this afternoon, right? 6 o'clock. And until then, please fill in the evaluation forms. Have a great MMS. Thank you so much for stopping by.